Hello. Welcome to Portland Cocktail Week Distance Learning. I am Brittany Leach Johnson, and today we are going to be joined by both David Blackmore, the Global Ambassador for Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, and Cameron George, the U.S. Ambassador for Ardbeg. Cameron is just checked into his hotel room because he's out helping people taste a bunch of delicious Ardbeg, so he'll be on the stream in a second. But I'm very excited to join my two friends back again for kicking off round 3 of Portland Cocktail Week, Ardbeg, and EWA Scotch Whiskey Diploma. We are so appreciative to the Ardbeg team for supporting this program, so much so that this is our 3rd go round doing it. And just the EWA team is 10 out of 10, 5 stars, love them. And the level of education that they're able to provide for our 50 students we have each time is really unmatched. And everyone leaves as the smokiest person in the room. So thanks, EWA, for that. Today, Cam and David are going to be taking us on a bit of a journey through the Ardbeg distillery expansion and the origins of the distillery. And you'll even get a peek behind the curtain to see how day-to-day distillery operations influences what ends up in your glass. So make sure to pack your questions because we would love to answer all of them for you. And we will get started here in just a second with David giving us a bit of the lay of the land coming to us live from Isla. But before we do that, there are a couple things I'd love for you to do. 1, like us on Facebook. There's a high chance you're watching this on our Facebook page, so go ahead and hit that like button. 2, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have one of those, and this class is airing there as well. So just go right ahead and subscribe for more classes. Comment below, ask questions, especially our 50 certification students. Make sure you drop us a line so we can count your present today. And finally, if you're vibing on all of the smoky content, I highly encourage you to go ahead and get that Portland Cocktail Week application in this week because there will be in-person smoky content from these two lovely humans at Portland Cocktail Week 2022 in person. So don't miss your chance to apply at pdxew.com/apply. And with that, I'm going to turn over first to David Blackmore so he can show us around what's going on. And then Cam's got like a bajillion slides for us. So guys, have at it.
Howdy. Hey. So welcome to Isla. I've been struggling to find Wi-Fi that works, so I'm currently sat in my car in the town of Port Ellen, which is about 1.5 miles from the Ardbeg distillery. 10-minute drive. The sun is just setting. It's been a good day. Bit cloudy, rained a little bit this afternoon, but we've had a fun day again at Ardbeg Distillery. I arrived a couple of days ago, and we've been doing a bunch of tastings and taking various people around the distillery. And what's been fun is showing people the new still house at Ardbeg, which we just opened just last year, really. And then going from that real new innovation and development to the other end of the scale into our oldest warehouses and sampling some really epic, amazing whiskies. So yeah, it's good to see Isla kind of bouncing back. It's mid to late September. In a normal year, it'd be starting to quieten down. The tourist season has not stopped. I think people, after 2 years of being sat at home, are traveling like crazy. So the place is busy, which is good to see for the community here for sure. But Port Ellen, the town, obviously well known as also the name of a long lost distillery, one of our fellow South Shore distilleries, which is now actually being resurrected. So it'd be good to have a 4th South Shore distillery here alongside Ardbeg. But Ardbeg, you go down this way, end of the road, as far as the road goes, we're the last distillery, leaving the last the best, of course. Hey, Cam. How are you doing, Cam?
Fantastic. It's good to see you there, David. I'm very jealous that you are back.
As you can see, I've got I know, I'm sorry. I know You would be. But you're going to laugh because it's been an absolute grey day here, and even just going outside and walking around, I've still managed to get sunburnt. So,
You're looking
it's
a little
impressive,
lobster.
right?
You've got a slight lobster.
Yeah, it's 2 days in a row. Two
No,
days in a row of getting thoroughly burnt. So
that is what you get for going to visit without me and Cam. So keep that in mind next time you're planning a trip and we're not there.
that is true.
Exactly. David brought up a little bit of history of Port Ellen. So for anybody who's watching, I would make the argument that Port Ellen is probably the most important township on the island, as Port Ellen is not only home to, well, call it one of the most iconic distilleries, the Port Ellen Distillery, which is now being relaunched and saved from the ashes, but it's also the closest township for Ardbeg, Lagavulin, and Lefroy, the three Kildalton distilleries. In addition to that, Port Ellen is an incredibly important area of the island as well, because it's also home to the only malting facility on the island as well. So Port Ellen Malting supplies 7 to 9 of the distilleries on the island with the raw ingredient of malted barley. So, 7 to 9 of the distilleries, actually the life source, the raw ingredient that they utilize to make heavily peated single malt Scotch whiskies, actually comes from this malting facility. If Port Ellen wasn't protected by the Mull of O, which, as our anybody who's already gone through the class, or maybe if you're just a massive fan of single malt Scotch whiskeys, has had a whiskey from Ardbeg called Ardbeg NO. If the Mull of O wasn't protecting Port Ellen in the way that it does from the really violent and kind of turbulent sea swells and ocean that really just batter the face and the coast of the Mull, then Port Ellen would just absolutely be, I believe it would be a bit more barren than it is now. Right now, the Port Ellen is home to a few hundred people, also home to one of what I believe is the coolest bar on Isla as well. The Port Ellen Inn on Isla Inn is this incredible small little hotel, very small boutique hotel. I usually like to stay there whenever we're on the island, and I'll actually even climb out the window of my hotel room and kind of sit out there with a glass of whiskey and watch the waves kind of break in across the face of the island there. But Port Ellen, its importance to the people of Isla and also the region of Isla cannot be overstated. It is an incredibly important area there. And you'll see
Blackmore was telling us earlier that Schifrin was enjoying that pub while we made him get in his Nissan Leaf and log us on to this show before he got to come out and walk us around.
So I thought I'd walk you around. Spur of the moment idea. Hopefully it's not too much wind picking up on my headphones, but there's the Ard View Inn. It's absolutely jumping right now. Here's the blue letterbox, the post office, and that's it. And there's the hotel down the end of the street. So this is about it. This is the size of Port Ellen. It's busy, hey?
Yeah.
Now it's gonna get noisy.
We already have a question. Jason wants to know if the majority of the population, like in Port Ellen or Isla in general, work in Scotch production in some way.
It's probably not the majority of the people in the population here, but it's the largest single. It probably is the largest single employer for sure. There's a lot of fishing. There's a lot of tourism as well happening on the island. And if I jump around here, it might get too noisy for my headphones. But let's show you the best bit here. Here we are. Here's Port Ellen Bay. I'm going to turn my mic off. Maybe tell me if it gets too loud. I'll go on mute. You get an idea here.
But Cam, do you think that David just dragged us all here so that he could rub it in that he's there and we're not there?
Oh, 1,000%. He's definitely doing this to make us feel just a bit bad. But to Jason's question there as well, David gave a fantastic answer. I would say that yes, not the majority of people work in the Scotch whiskey industry. but a large number of elixirs, as they're called, do work in either Scotch whiskey, or like David had mentioned, in fishing industry is also quite large, especially in Port Ellen as well. And tourism is actually quite large as well. Right now, there are a little over 3,200 so odd people that live on the island. The largest individual industry is going to be Scotch whiskey. There are also a multitude number of other distilleries that there are either are being refurbished and reestablished or are also breaking ground for the very first time. So some of the parallel industries that would run with those would also be things like construction as well. There's a lot of people who are coming onto the island who work in the construction arena and space that are now also building some of the new distilleries. There are also some new homes that are being built on the island as well, as the island is growing in size a bit. But also accommodations for a lot more of the travelers who are making their way onto the island to come visit, will need a bit more residential housing and places to stay. But that's a great question there as well.
Can you hear me? I just wanted to point out that tall building there in the center of the picture. That's the tallest building on Isla because it is the grain store, and that is when the barley comes in on the barley boat. That is where it will be initially stored. So the tallest building there, and Port Ellen Maltings, which is back over the hill here, where all that barley is malted. And then if you came down this way, further down the coast here, you can't quite see, about 3 miles down the road, you would have the three South Shore, the Froig, Lagavulin, Ardbeg distilleries down this way.
I already want to be there, David. You don't have to keep doing this to us, but I'm so glad that we're talking about new distilleries on Isla and Port Ellen specifically. I can't think of a better reason than to want to visit somehow even more, then because there's going to be more distilling. But I know that you have a ton of information, Cam, related to Ardbeg's distillery's origins and the expansion of the distillery and where we are now and how everything that happens in the facility gives us our delicious smoky juice. So do you want slides, or do you want to follow David around and just be jealous more? I'm open to either.
Let's give it a second before we pull up the slides, as I did have one more point to kind of drive home as well there, and then we can jump into some of the slides to set context for the conversations that we'll have over the next few weeks as well. But the very last point that I actually really wanted to kind of drive home is that when you step foot on the island, you are immediately overcome with this just sense of importance of the place that is Isla. There's this communicative kind of connection between the people and then also the provenance of the region of the island as well. So one of my favorite aromatic kind of components that comes to the island that's influenced by the whiskey industry, especially in Port Ellen, is actually the way that the township smells. On a really, really good day, the entirety of Port Ellen will actually smell a little bit like strawberry yogurt. And that is thumbs up. That's signs of a really, really healthy germination that's happening in terms of the malted barley that's being produced that day. So that Port Ellen is really it's really cooking in terms of the germination that they're creating. Whenever you drive into town and you smell just the light waft of even just strawberry yogurt, some light kind of fresh fruitiness in the air there as well, you'd be surprised. Most people would assume that the island just reeks of peat. And you can smell it a bit when you get a little bit closer to the malting facility. But for the most part, there is really just this fresh, soft fruitiness and sweetness to the air when you're walking around on the island. So that's the reason that I'm so jealous of
Well, and you and David actually talked a lot about that in a class from the last round of Scotch certification. That one what was the name? It was the one where we talked about the periodic table a whole bunch.
Yep.
If you go back and look at the classes, it's not Planet Ardbeg, it's Phenols 101. If you go back and watch the Phenols 101 class, you'll be able to find out more about the strawberry yogurt smell and why it is important and why everyone is on island looking for that smell.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, guys, as I drove past just about an hour ago, the strawberry yogurt smell was intense, and that's always a sign that the malting process is going really well. So good malting process means good whiskey in the future. So
Yeah.
happy days.
Somebody mute his microphone before I go get on an airplane.
David's also just walking past the police station as well here. So
There it is. That is the police station.
They need to convince you. This is a crime.
I'm going to try and walk down. I don't know if I'll be able to get there, but I'm going to walk down. Maybe you want to continue, but I'll see if I can get a shot of the Port Ellen maltings in a second.
that'd be great.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's jump into some of the slides. I'd also, let's go ahead and pull up the slides and presentation. I'd also add as well that conversely, a bad day of malting, which doesn't happen very often, but a bad day of maltings will actually smell a bit like wet cardboard. So that's how you know that something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. But that doesn't happen very often. To be honest, I've actually never smelled a poor maltings environment on Isla as well. The only reason that we know that is because Ardbeg's head distiller, now currently Colin Gordon, used to be the site manager for Port Ellen Maltings facility, and that's actually the first place that we met him. As David's being blown away by a windstorm, it would appear in the top left corner there as well, right? So welcome to the incredible wide world of Ardbeg. I'm very excited to introduce you to discovering the untamed spirit of Isla. Ardbeg Distillery, we are well known and renowned for making the most heavily peated whiskey in regular production. That means at the malting facility in Port Ellen, they have gone through steeping, germination, and then kilning, where they actually burn peat as the natural occurring fuel source. And that peat drives these phenols, and those phenols attach themselves to the outside of the malted barley. And we run a process called HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography. And if that malted barley doesn't come back registering as over 55 parts per million in terms of its phenol and phenolic content, then Ardbeg is not going to answer the phone. So welcome to the wide world of Ardbeg. You've already seen Isla's white sand beaches, thanks to David and the FOMO that he's all instilled us with as well. People oftentimes don't understand the region that is Isla. So the region of Isla is actually two different islands that over the course of time have been almost, you could even say, force welded together. The north side of the island actually comes from South America, or some of the rock that makes up South America, and it actually predates the southern side of the island. So if Wi-Fi was ideal, we would actually have David be driving around part of the island right now to show you the stark contrast and difference between the topography and the microflora and fauna of the region as well. On the north side of the island, the region seems to be a little bit more barren, less microflora and fauna, a little bit less vegetation. There are also drastically less and fewer peat bogs on the north side of the island than there are on the southern side of the island. The southern side of the island is home to about 3 different peat bogs, that almost kind of almost entirely engulf the island as well. So the north side of the island seems to be a little bit more rocky and barren than the southern side of the island. We can go ahead and push into the next slide there as well. So at Ardbeg, who we are is untamed, ultimate, and unorthodox. For those of us who were on the drop-in dram session yesterday, we actually got to try Ardbeg 10-year-old. So Ardbeg 10-year-old, in my mind, again, I don't want to tell anybody how to enjoy whiskey. I can only make slight inferences. So in my mind, Ardbeg 10-year-old is the embodiment of the 3 U's, the untamed, ultimate, and unorthodox nature of the Ardbeg distillery. We can go ahead and push into the next slide that actually shows, awesome. We can actually push into the next slide that actually shows the foot of the distillery there, and then now sets a little bit of context for the region of Isla as well. So you saw that Isla is the small, we were on the right one there. We were on the right one. Awesome. So you'll see that Isla is a small island off of the southwest coast of Scotland. And Ardbeg distillery sits on the southern shore of the island itself. As we've mentioned a couple of times, our next door neighbors are Lagavulin, immediately next to Ardbeg, and then Lefroy, which is next to Lagavulin. It's about a 10-minute walk from Ardbeg to Lagavulin, and about a 15 to 20-minute walk from Ardbeg to Lefroy distillery. There's also a fourth distillery that's going to join the 3 Kildalton distilleries on the southern side of the island as well. We're very much so looking forward to the region of Isla growing. Currently, there are 9 operational distilleries, but then there is a 10th that's being refurbished, which is Port Ellen, and then an 11th that is on the way that I had already mentioned as well. So, David, it looks like you are walking down the beach towards Port Ellen malting facility right now. I can see it in the background.
I am. Can you hear me? Is it okay? I'm trying to protect my microphone from the wind. What you're seeing in front of you here, the big building, this is the Port Ellen maltings. It's hard to tell because it's grey sky and everything, but it is actually functioning right now. There's some peat smoke coming out of those chimneys. To the left here are the old warehouses for the legendary old Port Ellen distillery, and then you've got all the way around here to the Mull of O, if you've heard of Ardbeg Anno, named after the mull here, and actually impossible to see, but just where I'm pointing would be the singing sands of Isla, which are Trivan sands, just along here, where we tried to get to earlier today. Didn't quite manage, but yes. So there you go. That's the live from the Port Ellen maltings. There you go.
Love it. David, if you wouldn't mind panning to the right as well, back inland on the island there as well. So right over here you're actually looking at Isla's back to the left just a little bit further. Perfect, right there. So what we're actually looking at there is Isla's only rum distillery as well. Even though single malt Scotch whiskey is the native spirit of Isla, and also I would also say the penultimate spirit being produced in Scotland, on Isla there's also a very famous distillery that makes a delicious gin at the Bruichladdich distillery. And then there's, of course, the Isla Rum Company, which makes a very Jamaican in style rum on Isla as well. Even though it's molasses based, they operate utilizing a double retort still as well. So Isla is home to not only single malt production, but also a couple of other spirit categories as well, which I find quite interesting. This little chapel to the right that David's also looking at is the home of a yearly whiskey tasting that happens during an event called Féisial, which is a celebration of all things Ilic and all things Isla as well there. So David and I had the privilege of attending the whiskey tasting, which is actually where we got to try the Isla Rum Company's rum for the very first time. Right. We're not here to talk about rum. We're here to talk about single malts. Bad boy, Cameron, get back on track there. So let's go ahead and pull up the slides. Unless, Brittany, we have any questions.
Well, we do have a couple. One I'm gonna save for a little bit later right now. But one is directly related to Féisial. Is the Ardview Inn available to be booked if you wanted to come to Féisial? Is that a place you can stay?
You better be booking it now. You better be booking it now.
Book it up if you want it.
Yeah, the Féis is an incredible experience. It was actually my first Féis this year. It is almost impossible to find accommodations the closer you get to Féis. And also it is really, really difficult to get reservations at restaurants on the island as well. I believe there were over 1,500 people who were visiting the island. So the overall, I guess, population of the island increased by a little over about 50 to 60% during Féis as well. Many of the people who actually come, weirdly enough, are German fans of single malt. And you'll actually see the Germans, a lot of them drive over in their camper vans and actually park right on the beaches that David's walking around on. Don't get hit by those cars there, David. Look both ways. Definitely make sure you look left for sure.
The other important thing to mention and this is increasingly becoming true at all times on Islay, is do not assume, if you do not have your own transportation, do not assume you can just rock up and call a taxi. You need to be booking taxis before you even get to Islay, and they're so busy these days. There's very difficult to just call a taxi on the spur.
Okay, so book your accommodations, book your taxi now. And Fagiel, is that in May?
End of May, yeah. Last week of May into the first few days of June.
Is there any chance of maybe they move that around so that I can go?
I think that's why Brittany, I heard that's actually why they put it there.
Oh, trying to keep me out, guys. All right, that's fair. Well, Kim, then I'll let you go back to your slides. I know what I'm not wanting.
Love it, love it. Actually, this little house that David's passing on the left right here now, this house right there, one of the most memorable nights. Yep, that one with the cream coloration to it there. That is a wonderful little inn there as well. That is able to be rented. And then next door to that, the house with the blue trimming right there, that one right there. I remember actually meeting the people who own that house at the Isla Inn just down the street there. And we ended up having a few beers and having some single malts. And then they actually invited the group that I was with back to their house. And we went and we sat there and probably drank whiskey until maybe 4 or 5 in the morning. I learned how to play the bagpipes, not well, but terribly, which it was very stunning that nobody ended up complaining. I guess, it must just be part of Isla life to be up very late at night, drinking and learning how to play the pipes there as well. So lots of great memories here in Port Ellen. Let's go ahead and pull the slides back up, if you wouldn't mind there. So our place in the whiskey world, as we had discussed, just off of the southwest coast of Scotland, you'll find Islay, and you'll find all 9 operational distilleries on the island as well. We'll go ahead and push into the next slide, which will actually tell us a little bit about the category of whiskey. So for those of you who are not part of the EWA Scotch Whisky Diploma offered by Lush Life, Ardbeg, and the Edinburgh Whisky Academy, which is, of course, the best-in-class whiskey educational program, for those of you who are not familiar with the program, this is an opportunity for us to discuss, well, what is whiskey? Most of you bartenders are pretty well versed in whiskey, so we'll breeze through this, but I'll quickly make mention that whiskey is a category that is absolutely defined under international law. It's the fermentation and distillation of cereal grains that are then aged in an oak vessel. So as a 30,000 foot look down on the category, that's a pretty generic definition. So as we push into the next slide here, you'll actually see that whiskey is distilled all around the world. Knowledge of whiskey distillation didn't originate in Scotland. It actually was the Irish that created the idea of distilling cereal grains and then aging them for any assorted amount of time and creating the category of whiskey. But knowledge of distillation actually came from parts of Southern Asia and actually came up into the Fertile Crescent, coming over into Northern Africa and into parts of Spain and being carried by the Moors up into parts of Europe as well. So the first area of whiskey distillation was Ireland. But the reason that Islay is so incredibly important is because Islay is really only about 30 so odd miles away from northeastern Ireland as the crow flies. On a really good day from where David is walking aroundabouts, you can actually see Northern Ireland on a really, really good day. Today, David probably has no visibility and can't see all the way over to Ireland. But it would have been the monks that brought knowledge of whiskey distillation from North Ireland all the way to Islay. And then from Islay, it's actually about 18 miles back over to mainland Scotland. So it would have been the monks that actually brought whiskey distillation with them from Ireland to Islay and then all the way over to mainland Scotland there. with places that we now know whiskey distillation has taken foothold. Of course, here in the United States of America, we make the iconic bourbon whiskey. If you're a massive bourbon fan, I'll forgive you eventually. Just kidding. I'm a huge bourbon fan as well. Of course, there's rye whiskey being made here in the United States. There's also single malt. Very recently here in the US, there were some legislation or proposed legislational changes that now actually define American single malt as a category. I can't necessarily say that I agree with all of the legislation that was proposed. I think the point of distillation is too high. I think that going into virgin American oak also doesn't showcase the intentionality with which single malt should be produced. And I also don't necessarily agree with the idea that column still distillates are able to be called single malt Scotch whiskey. Column stills produce whiskey in a very clean and maximized efficiency style of production. They rip and strip out of the heart and soul of that spirit a lot of the organic compounds and congeners that we as the end drinkers in single malt Scotch whiskey identify as the possible diaspora of flavors, right? So, I can't necessarily say that I'm fully on board with the single malt landscape here in the US, but the fact that it is becoming legislated does give me a little bit of hope. Of course, in Canada, they'll make some delicious rye whiskeys as well. There are some incredible whiskeys being made in Taiwan, incredible whiskeys being made in Japan, some beautiful distillates coming from India, and actually in the UK as well, I guess in Europe as well, in parts of England, there are now some single malts that are being made there that are absolutely incredible. And of course, you have the iconic whiskeys coming from Australia as well. So, what do all of these regions have in common? Well, I actually believe that even though Scotland didn't start the idea of single malt Scotch whiskey or whiskey distillation, it's where whiskey distillation was actually perfected. And from there, the jumping off point has landed whiskey in countries around the world. You look at the landscape of American whiskey, which, the father of American whiskey, I'll put air quotes on that, Dr. James Crowe. Dr. James Crowe, who created the idea of sour mashing or patented the idea of sour mashing in bourbon whiskey. James Crowe is from Scotland. He's from Inverness. You look at the category of Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey utilizes the exact same spelling of whiskey as Scotch whiskey does as well, without the E. Same for the Japanese. Master Taketsuru, who studied whiskey distillation in the lowlands of Scotland, then took that knowledge of how to distill whiskey back to Japan. And you've seen some wonderful and incredible distillates happening there. The incredible distilleries in India also utilize classic or very Scottish distillation techniques as well. The temperature differences just so happen to be massive in between Scotland and India. So you can see the way that Scotland has influenced whiskey distillation from around the world. Let's go ahead and push into the next slide here as well, because this will allow us to talk about Scotch whiskey specifically. So if whiskey distillation or if whiskey from around the world is defined as the fermentation and distillation of cereal grains that are then aged in an oak vessel, well, Scotch whiskey is essentially fermentation, distillation of cereal grains that are then aged for at least 3 years in an oak cask. And all of that production has to happen in Scotland exclusively. Let's go ahead and push into the next one here as well, where we now get to have a conversation about what peated whiskeys are. So Ardbeg, along with our sister distilleries, our good friends at Lagavulin, Laphroaig, Bowmore, Colilla. You'll also have the iconic Bunnahabhain as well, Ardnahoe, Bruichladdich. All of these distilleries in one way, shape, or form either specialize in or experiment with peat. So the way that peat is utilized in single malt whiskey production is during the malting process. In malting, you have a couple of different steps or stages. You, of course, have steeping, which is where you are going to saturate the grains with water, raising the internal moisture content from 12 to about 43%. 43 to 45% is kind of the safe space there. That's now going to allow for germination to happen. And then germination is done at Port Ellen in what's called a drum. We have a pneumatic malting system. So that drum, essentially, you can imagine like a tumble dryer, but without the heat, right? The idea in germination isn't to dry the malted barley. It's actually to turn it and rotate it very slowly to ensure that the rootlets don't grip and kind of intertwine themselves. Now, into kilning. Kilning is where you're actually going to utilize peat. So you burn peat for about 14 hours, driving a lot of that phenol and a lot of that smoke that's going to attach itself to the outside of the malted barley. And from there, you actually move that malted barley over to Ardbeg. Let's jump into the next one here as well. Awesome. So, well, what is peat? People ask this all the time, and I'm sure Brittany already has some questions about this in the chat here as well. People always ask, well, what is peat? If you've watched any of these before, we've covered it a couple of times, but I'm more than happy to discuss it right now as well. It's effectively buildup of partially decaying plant or organic matter in natural areas that are defined as peatlands or peat mires. So essentially, it's just decomposing plant matter that exists in a very, very moist and saturated environment. This will slow the rate of decay so that when you cut down into a peat bog, as you can see on the screen here, there's actually a lot of fibrous materials. That's why peat has been utilized to heat the homes on Isla, to cook food on Isla, and ultimately to make whiskeys that are typified as Elic or Isla whiskeys as well. Awesome. So let's push ahead into discovering the smokiest drink in the room. At Ardbeg, as I've mentioned, we make the most heavily peated whiskeys in regular production. As you will have seen from the visage and the viewpoint that David had brought up a little bit earlier, David's actually looking, or was looking, at this hillside, this peninsula, if you will. This is actually the Mull of O, and which is why we actually have Ardbeg NO displayed in front of it as well here. So the Mull of O is an incredibly important landmass on Isla. I'm sure we'll do a course later on in the coming weeks that actually discusses the importance of the Mull. So I'm not going to cut the legs out from under myself here as well. And we'll talk a little bit about phenol levels before we jump any further. Let's go into the next slide there. So phenol levels. The distilleries on Isla will utilize varying levels of phenol and varying levels of peat. On Isla, of course, peat is the naturally occurring fuel source, so it's only right that most of the whiskey distilleries utilize peat from Isla to make their single malt and to produce their whiskeys. Some of the distilleries on Isla will use very, very low levels of peat, and by proxy will achieve a very low phenolic level. You may be familiar with Bruichladdich makes the classic laddie, which is an unpeated to very lightly peated single malt Scotch whiskey that uses peat that actually comes to them from the mainland, as they are one of the two distilleries that doesn't actually malt on Isla. Not for better or for worse, but they are a very lightly peated whiskey. Then, of course, you'll have distilleries like Bunnahabhain. Bunnahabhain, who makes some medium level peated whiskeys, makes some incredible whiskeys from the Bunnahabhain distillery. They actually do source their malted barley from Port Ellen malting facility. It just so happens that they're looking for a phenolic content of about 20 to 30 parts per million, really at tops there. And then you'll move into heavily peated. So heavily peated whiskey distilleries are going to be ones like Colilla, going to be distilleries like Lagavulin, going to be distilleries like Lefroy as well, all of whom utilize peat that's coming from malted barley that's coming from Port Ellen, that's been peated to about 35 to maybe about 45 parts per million. And then on the other side of heavily peated, you're going to have Ardbeg. So Ardbeg, we utilize heavily peated malted barley that comes to us, again, from Port Ellen, that's been peated to a level of 55 parts per million and upwards. There is really no cap for Ardbeg. We'll utilize malted barley of quite a wide range. The more phenolically driven, the better in our mindset. Port Ellen malting facility actually, because its pneumatic malting system is quite small in comparison to some of the other maltings across Scotland, Port Ellen actually has a capacity to really, in a cap, to only be able to produce malted barley that ranges between, again, 20 parts per million, and the maximum that they've actually been able to achieve is about 110 to 120, depending on which maltster you're asking there. Colin Gordon, who's our distillery manager, has told me that the highest phenol level he's ever been able to achieve with a batch of malted barley was actually 110. But then at another time, another maltster actually ended up telling me that they've seen 120. So it's somewhere right around there, right? Brittany, any questions before I push on into the heart and soul of Ardbeg Distillery?
Carol, I still have your question that I'm going to save for the end, but we do have a question specifically about peat and phenol level. Shocking. This is always one where a lot of questions come in. But is there a limit to what the human palate can taste in terms of peat levels? Is there a point where it's kind of like, you know how they say that, like, if your sunscreen's over like SPF 70 or whatever, like, it's not, like, that's kind of where it tops out. That might not be the right number, so don't come for me in the comments. I'm more of a tanning oil kind of gal. But is there a like level like that with peat levels where it's just like, yeah, I mean, you can do it, but it kind of just doesn't even matter anymore?
Yeah. I would say that the human palate can really only perceive about 12 to 15 different phenols. It's not necessarily how many, but which specific ones, right? Because it's the human palate that's perceiving those. There are, in OChem, there are tens of thousands of recognized phenolic compounds, but our palate can really only perceive about 12 to 15 of them if you are a super taster, right? And there are many more women in the world who are super tasters than there are men. So it's not necessarily that a whiskey can be so heavily peated that you stop being able to, taste or identify specific phenols. It's just that as human beings, our papilla and our senses are only able to perceive a specific range of phenols, right? Which I think is quite interesting because, when you run a test like HPLC, that high performance liquid chromatography, it's telling you how many and then also which specific phenols are active in that malted barley as well. So if you are, let's say, achieving 300 parts per million in malted barley, well, thumbs up, good for you. But are any of those phenols actually going to be able to be perceived and actually be discernible? Right. So, it's not necessarily how many, it's which specific ones. I'd also say that in single malt, the category of single malt is, and actually the category of whiskey loves to tell half truths, if you can call them that as well. Because while the malted barley will be peated at, let's say at Ardbeg, will be peated to 55 parts per million plus, the end drink of the actual phenol in the whiskey itself is much less because you've lost a lot of those phenols during the process. So, the half truth there with the industry, it's not just us at Ardbeg, it's the industry has chosen to highlight the number of phenol that's represented in the actual raw ingredient rather than in the end drink, because they've assumed that older is better and that the larger number of phenols is sexier, call it that, right?
Okay. That's a great for everyone watching, but particularly our Scotch Whisky Diploma students, I would like to take this time to remind you that you go over to PDXCW on Instagram in our link tree, you can find a link to the periodic table and the flavor wheel that Cam uses to talk about these things a lot. They're really helpful tools. I enjoy using them and I find them helpful. And I know Cam still has a lot of slides to go through and we don't have a lot of time left because we were looking at Port Ellen and it was gorgeous and that's totally worth the time. But on last session's Scotch Whisky Diploma, on that Phenols 101 class, David and Cam got really into a lot of detail about peat and phenolic compounds and all of the science behind this stuff. And I know you all have plenty of studying to do, but at your leisure, I do encourage you to check it out because it's very informative and super cool.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. As we're pushing forward in the presentation here, I think it is really important to note that peated whiskeys are now more relevant than ever. As bartenders, we've oftentimes, been a bit afraid of the unknown, right? But we've also been these, Epicureans and explorers of possible flavors. So there's this love that's happened in bartending of things like mezcal that showcase smoke. So, one of my beliefs is that there are three kind of categories that, even though they don't necessarily at first sight share a lot in common, but when you start to dig down, Pete pun right there, when you start to dig down into the categories themselves, you'll find traces of influence from each other. So, those three overarching and overlapping categories for me are single malt Scotch whiskey, of course, heavily peated single malt, and then also mezcal, right? There's a smokiness and an esteriness to both of those two different categories. And then also the third overlapping category is rum. And while people would say, well, rum isn't always smoky, I would say that any smoke that comes from a rum, it comes inherently from the maturation space. But then also rums, historically, a lot of them have been produced on inherently Scottish distillation techniques, right? And then the link between mezcal and heavily peated single malt is going to be the trace of smoke there. So as we're thinking about cocktails and putting different elements and different ingredients into cocktails, consider heavily peated single malts, because again, truly, peated whiskey and smoke is now more relevant than it's ever been as well. So we can go ahead and push forward into showing you one of my favorite things about Ardbeg. The Ardbeg distillery has had a flair for the dramatic. The distillery has at times led the category in innovation. One of the experiments that we did a few years ago, as I mentioned, was actually a white paper on the effects of zero gravity in maturation. So we sent a bunch of whiskey with a company called Nanorax up to outer space to go through maturation on the International Space Station. It wasn't full barrels. It was small little subsamples. We also mentioned this in one of the previous classes that we did. I'm more than happy to make available the white paper that was written by Dr. Bill, because it is truly out of this world to take that directly from the screen there. Let's go ahead and push forward just a little bit as well here. We'll have a nice
little one constant in all of our lives. That's gravity. And it's only been in the last few decades with the space age that we can play around and do things without that force that we call 1G. And so that's what this project with Ardbeg is all about. What happens if you grow molecules, in this case terpenes that were grown in whiskey, without that 1G? What do we learn? The Ardbeg canisters had to travel to the same launch site where Sputnik, the first satellite, was launched from, and the first man, Yuri Gagarin.
And we had liftoff of the Soyuz.
This is a place where humanity took its first steps off the planet. To our knowledge, no one has really studied how terpenes react in microgravity. What we learn in this project is not just about Scotch. Terpenes are the building blocks in a number of consumer products. The question here is, as the terpenes are exposed to the oak, will they behave differently? Will you get a different taste? And for the past 2 years, they've been sitting there on the space station, hopefully aging away and coming up with all new flavors, we hope, to get it back down on the Earth. And they'll put the nano lab filled with the canisters, the Ardbeg canisters, in the U.S. approved cargo, and we've reserved precious space at the feet of the astronaut. And they'll close the door and they'll push back and decouple from the space station, and then they begin the descent.
And there is the Soyuz under its chutes as we are standing by for touchdown. Touchdown confirmed. Right on the button, 8:23 a.m. on the steppe of Kazakhstan, back on Earth.
And when they land, they remove the astronaut. Then they'll reach in and take out the American cargo, including our Ardbeg. They put it on the NASA jet, and it flies to Houston. And my guys take it off the jet, and we'll have some very rigorous examination working with the scientists at Ardbeg to see if the terpenes have behaved differently. It's been a long process with a lot of folks, both at Nanorax, NASA, the Russian Space Agency, the cosmonauts, astronauts, all involved in this. And that's why space is so difficult.
Love it. That's one of my absolute favorite videos. I just thought that I would include it again. At Ardbeg, again, we love to test. We love to test the limits of peatiness. We also love to test the limits of the realm of possibility within single malt. So who would have thought, a distillery that was founded in 1815 would one day lead experiments in outer space? I just think that there's something magical to that.
I think anyone who's ever met Dr. Bill would think that was a possibility. As much fun as he has making whiskey and as willing as he is to try anything just to see if it turns out really cool. We do have a question here, but I want to let you know we have some folks who are in this round of Scotch certification who have previously taken our Canadian whiskey certification. And I was joking heavily with our friends from Corby about sending whiskey to space because I get to see both programs. So I know that this is something that Ardbeg has done. And they're like, in the comments, they're like, here we go again, more space whiskey. So I love that Ardbeg did this. I think it's super fun. And, there's only one way to find out if something's going to work, and that's just to do it. So I appreciate y'all having the ingenuity to get us some whiskey up to space to see how that worked out. But Daniel wants to know, if you took whiskey from the same distillation batch and you kept it on the ground to compare how the space whiskey turned out versus how that same distillate turned out being aged here on planet Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there was a control set of samples that actually went through the exact same process, but in Dr. Bill's laboratory in Edinburgh. And then one set of samples obviously went to the space station. So there were identifiable differences in the terpenes in both of the samples as well. So there is an effect of microgravity on maturation from what we've learned throughout that experiment. What we'll do with that information and knowledge, who knows? I can imagine that first off, we couldn't legally send whiskey to space and then bring it back and bottle it as single malt Scotch whiskey because production has to happen in Scotland, obviously. And last time I checked, outer space is not Scotland. But maybe Dr. Bill can find a loophole, better yet, can find a wormhole there as well. Some more space puns. I love it. But there were differences.
I think we just need to get an Ardbeg space station, plant the flag of Scotland up there and be like, hey, this is our territory too. So now we're doing this. But I'll see if I can find the right people to talk to and work on that. While David enjoys being in Port Ellen and hanging out at the pub. I'm actually really excited he's there because y'all got to see some footage. But he's also he's there with another member of the Ardbeg team that we get to work with on this project, showing him around Ardbeg and Glenmorangie and how cool, like how much fun. But anyway, I know you got more slides to go. I'll let you get back to it. But yes, more space whiskey. I will never stop pushing space whiskey for those of you who've heard this song and dance before.
Actually, one of the fun things with Ardbeg, every 2 or so years, we have our marketeers, come up with a new marketing campaign. And it's not often that whiskey production and then whiskey marketing kind of get along. But with Ardbeg, it's interesting because there's a really close relationship between how our whiskey production team and how our whiskey marketing department actually work. And I actually think that on the Ardbeg side, we really, really nail it. I probably shouldn't say anything disparaging about our sister distillery of Glenmorangie, but Glenmorangie, I believe, should take some nods from the Ardbeg's marketing department. Let's say that diplomatically there.
The marketing team does a great job making it fun and interesting and always coming up with new campaigns. Like Monsters of Smoke was so fun, really embracing that like kind of Halloween-y old horror film vibe. Like they do a great job. And obviously everyone at the distillery does a great job making the whiskey to market. So great work all around, Ardbeg team.
Great work all around. And, later on, actually this month, we will be unveiling the new marketing strategy for Ardbeg and the new thematic, strategy around Ardbeg. I loved Monsters of Smoke. The B horror movie theme spoke right to my soul because I love night like the Living Dead, Night of the Living Dead, and whatnot as well. So that just really spoke to me. But I'm also a massive fan of comic books, and I'm a huge comic book nerd. And so watch that space quite literally, because our marketing, I guess, scheme for the next year and beyond as well is something that we've nicknamed Planet Ardbeg. And we've actually worked with some pretty famous comic book authors and artists from around the world to draw up and create a series of comic books that tell the story of each of the whiskeys in the core range and how they catapult you to a world of their own making outside of planet Earth as well. So super excited for that.
I'm so excited for the launch of the new campaign and to get to create events around so much fun artwork and so like just such a fun new campaign. But any of you who will be attending Alumni Weekend for Spooky Camp, we will be incorporating some Monsters of Smoke fun there. We've got a couple of fun and scary, but not too scary surprises for you. So don't say goodbye to Monsters of Smoke just yet, but do get ready for Planet Ardbeg. All right, Cam, take it away.
Love it. So we'll push on into the next couple of slides here before we land the proverbial plane. Ardbeg is a whiskey that really loves to celebrate in unconventional style. I had mentioned the event that is Fèis. The last day of the Fèis festival is actually always known as Ardbeg Day, and we throw these beautiful, beautiful, extravagant events. This year, the whiskey that we launched to celebrate Ardbeg Day was one that was called Ardbeg Ardcore, which took the classic Ardbeg malted barley, peated to a level of 55 to 65, around 65 parts per million, and then married that to malted barley that actually went through a roasting process. So we, after malting, ended up taking that barley and roasting it very similar to coffee beans at a temperature upwards of 400 degrees. That creates a drastic, basically a Maillard effect. It's a bronzing or a browning of sugars, but pushed to the absolute extreme. So that barley came back almost jet black. And we incorporated that as part of the recipe for Ardbeg Ardcore. And it made the whiskey almost like biting into a spiky metal ball, is how Dr. Bill described it. So very much so a whiskey of unconventional and non-traditional style there as well. The masterminds behind the whiskey that we make at Ardbeg that you'll see on the next slide here is actually one Dr. Bill Lumsden. At Ardbeg, you have, of course, Dr. Bill Lumsden, who's at the head of the whiskey creation team. The whiskey creation team also includes Colin Gordon. It also includes Gillian McDonald, who is basically the head of more or less whiskey distillation, as well as the head of maturing whiskey stocks. And then you'll also have Jackie Thompson. Those are the people who are really at the heart and soul of the Ardbeg distillery. But of course, you have some incredible distillers who work at the distillery, who actually operate the stills. You have known as stillmen. You also have those who work the warehouses, the warehouse men and women, the people who work the filling stations, and then also the people who work out of the offices at Ardbeg, as well as the tour guides. So, there's a lot of hands that go into making and producing Ardbeg. And that's one of the reasons that I think Scotch whiskey is so important, because Scotch whiskey will always be a communication between the place, the people, the provenance, and the process that goes into making these whiskeys as well, right? So that's actually Dr. Bill hanging out in one of the dunnage warehouses at Ardbeg. And I'll show you all the last slide here as we actually discuss a little bit about where we've been. We've discussed where we're going, and we've also discussed a little bit of our achievements in outer space. I think this is a pretty fun place to land our conversation, as we'll talk a little bit about the history of the distillery itself. So Ardbeg is a distillery that, despite centuries of warfare, taxation, changes in economic tides, Isla's resilient population has kept the whiskey making process alive. And you see that absolutely embodied at Ardbeg Distillery. Ardbeg has illegal and illicit distillation in its DNA. Even though we proudly claim that we started making whiskey in 1815, our kind of secret side or illicit distilling side of the distillery actually started back in the 1790s, about 1796, when we actually founded not founded, but we started distilling whiskey illegally under cover of darkness at a site that's known as Arnhem Basht, or Home of the Beast, which is the farm that Ardbeg actually still sits on today. So I find it very interesting that even though we started it in 1815, the distillery actually has a life that exists long before that. So then up through parts of the 1830s, the distillery was incredibly active. It switched ownership and hands a couple of times between 1830 and 1860. The real life of Ardbeg actually was catapulted to the stratosphere in 1887 when it actually became the largest distillery on the island. We changed hands a couple more times before actually being sheltered and shut off almost entirely in 1980. The distillery remained silent from 1981 all the way through 1989. There was light distillation that happened in some of the 1990s, 92, 93. A little bit of distillation happened. That distillation actually happened because our good friends 2 doors down at the Lefroy distillery ended up coming over to Ardbeg every so often to make sure that the stills in the distillery didn't fall into total disrepair. So Ardbeg, this site and this view of Ardbeg would have looked very, very different back in the 90s. All of the buildings would have been this gross brown color as the distillery hadn't been painted in years. There would have been mold. There would have been roofs. There would have roofs that were completely caved in, shingles missing from most of the roofs as well. But now Ardbeg is in a period of renaissance. We renovated the distillery in 1997 at the behest of Dr. Bill Lumsden, who had recently taken over as the distillery manager and head of distillation for Glenmorangie Company. So when Dr. Bill got to lay his hands on Ardbeg for the very first time, the distillery was almost completely in disrepair. It was supposed to be knocked down. But like a phoenix rising from the ashes, we've now gone on to be one of the most highly awarded distilleries on the planet, winning World Whiskey Distillery of the Year 5 times, with Ardbeg 10-year-old, our flagship whiskey, winning World Whiskey of the Year over 4 times. Ardbeg Uigeadail, which was just named World Whiskey of the Year for 2022, winning World Whiskey of the Year multiple times, and same for Corey Vrecken as well. So we're in this renaissance period and period of success for the distillery now. So that's a little bit about where we've been, where we're going, and how Ardbeg has basically defied and beaten the odds to become what is now the greatest distillery on earth, if you ask myself and many eliks from around the world as well.
I tend to agree with you. I don't think that's an overstatement at all. I might be a little bit biased because this is one of my getting to work with Ardbeg and Glenmorangie is honestly one of my favorite parts of my job. It's always really great when you get to go to work and you get to work with brands that you're really excited about and you really believe in and you can't wait to share them with other people. So I appreciate you all letting me work on the project, and I do agree that Ardbeg is the best distillery in the world. So we do have a couple of questions. There's one I've been saving for a little while, but I think it'll kind of wrap us up here. So first, we're going to do a different question first. Is there like a mold that occurs that goes on like the outside of like the barrel storage facilities or the distillery like there is in Kentucky?
Yes, there is a mold that develops in the maturation spaces. That mold feeds on wood sugars, and it also feeds on the evaporative loss that happens during maturation. I cannot remember the mold's specific name, and I was just thinking about this the other day. That's why this question is so funny. But at Ardbeg, the buildings themselves will be repainted annually, the dunnage warehouses as they're called. So you won't see the mold on the outside of the warehouses. But when you walk around in the warehouse itself, the pathways that they've created in the warehouse, if you step off of that pathway, you are stepping directly into this thick film of muck and mold that actually starts to become residual on a lot of the pathways and walking areas as well. Great question. And I'll get you the name of that mold. I was just thinking about this on last Friday, actually.
When I was in France for the Hennessy My Way trip, another LVMH brand that I dearly love, we went to the founder's cellar and it had the same. So I think that that's kind of like, maybe it's universal. I don't know, but great question. And then the final question before we do our outro, kind of came from the beginning of the video, but I was like, I think Cam might have a little bit to say about that. So I'll save it from the end. So talking about the Port Ellen malting facility, like, do they get bad deliveries? Obviously, if something's off, I would assume it's rejected. But if bad barley was able to make it in, would that affect the entire grain elevator?
I love it. I love it. I love it. This is a great question. And I'll actually preface this answer by taking us back in the video to when David was walking around right outside of the malting facility, or you could see the maltings in the distance. And I mentioned that really late night that I had learning how to play the bagpipes. So when I was hanging out with the folks that owned that house and that home, the woman who I was speaking to she had worked at Bamor for about 30 plus years. Bamor being a wonderful distillery on Isla as well. And I was asking her about a certain distillery on the island that loves to tout that their barley is grown specifically on Isla. And I asked her opinion on this, and I like a child was just waiting for her answer. And she gave me one of the most stark and just frank answers I think she possibly could have. And she said, Cam, you can't make great whiskey from shite barley. And on Isla, we do not grow great barley. And so most of the barley that is malted at Port Ellen malting facility does not come from Isla specifically. What you're really looking for in terms of quality barley is you're looking for a consistent size of the kernels. That's why single malt Scotch whiskey distilleries utilize what's called 2-row barley here in the United States, because most of the distilleries use what's called a hammer mill as opposed to a 4-roller mill, which is basically 2 sets of roller pins that crush the malted barley down into grit, into husk, and into flour. Entirely it's called grist, but its contents are grit, flour, and husk. So because most of the distilleries, I think all but 2 single malt distilleries in Scotland, use a 4-roller mill, they need 2-row barley because 2-row barley has a much more consistent kernel size, and 6-row barley, because it's 6 kernels that are growing on one stalk, you have an inconsistent kernel size because they're fighting for nutrients, they're fighting for space as well. So when you use a hammer mill, you're able to pulverize that barley, as opposed to a roller mill, which is going to crack it open, and then you hand adjust the gradient of the rollers to basically crush it either finer into flour or more open into husk, right? Grit is somewhere in between there. So for Port Ellen malting facility, it's important to them that they have consistent kernel size. And then it's also important that barley has come to them at below 13% moisture, so that it doesn't get any sort of infections or diseases, right? And so that it can remain dormant as well. The other important thing with malted barley is actually to understand how active the enzymatic conversion of starch to sugars is going to be, to fermentable sugars is going to be. When you're talking about single malt Scotch whiskey, from 1 ton of malted barley, you want to be able to make about 400 to 410 liters of pure alcohol, right? So anything less than that is not ideal. The current kind of it girl in terms of the malted barley, as if anybody who was on the drop-in drams, Vic and I were discussing this a little bit yesterday, the current it girl that's the malted barley varietal that's being used now, because they are changed every few years to basically protect the species from infestations. The current it girl is one that you call Sassy, which I kind of love the name right there.
I like that.
Sassy barley. And Sassy actually has a really, really high propensity for making and generating alcohol by volume. At Ardbeg alone, right now, we're able to achieve about 415 plus. So that's really, really good. So Port Ellen malting facility, they do not very often receive batches that they reject, because the barley in most of Europe is quite healthy. The Glenmorangie distillery will use exclusively Scottish grown barley, whereas because Port Ellen malting facility is owned by Diageo, and Diageo's tentacles are a bit longer, so they source barley from parts of Scotland, also parts of Germany as well. But as long as it's 2-row, and as long as it will create over 410 liters of pure alcohol, those are basically what Port Ellen's looking for. That's a great question.
Excellent. Well, shout out to the fine folks at Port Ellen Malting Facility for making sure we have everything we need to get all of this beautiful whiskey. Mm-hmm. And I think with that, it is time for us to do our outros and let you go back to your afternoon, all of you beautiful people. Number one, if you enjoyed this class, I know you did because we talked about space whiskey. Make sure you hit the like or love button and tell Cam and David thank you in the comments for spending their afternoon telling us all kinds of fun things about Ardbeg. If you want to see more Portland Cocktail Week classes just like this one, you can follow Portland Cocktail Week on Facebook or on YouTube. We have both, whatever you prefer. And you do want to see more classes like this one because we have 3 more coming up in this series and you don't want to miss them. You can also find us at PDXCW on Instagram. We were talking about that a little earlier. That link tree is hot with the periodic table and the flavor compass. So make sure you check that out. And you can always find out what we have coming up next by following the Instagram. Make sure you follow Cam on Instagram because he always has really cool pictures on his Instagram. And I like his Instagram, and you will too. I'm certain of it. And if you want to do stuff like this, IRL in November, wrap up the year with some in-person tasting, in-person learning, in-person hanging out, go to pdxcw.com/apply. Applications close on October 6th. Definitely at 11:59 p.m., but I'm going to be honest with you, I can't remember if that one's set for 11:59 Eastern or 11:59 Pacific. So get it in before 11:59 Eastern on October 6th, and you'll be fine. In addition to the education that Ardbeg will be doing at Portland Cocktail Week, we'll also have some Highland Games fun, and Ardbeg and Glenmorangie will be sponsoring Brown and Balance. So you'll want to come to that party because it is super fun. So that is all the things that I'm required to say to you before we end this broadcast. Cam, thanks for running around Tampa to get where you needed to be to give us all of this info. And I will see all of you soon. Don't forget to study ahead because we got another round of EWA classes next week. And that is exactly where we'll see most of you. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Cheers all.